So it turns out that I'm not registered for tomorrow. And so, but they have agreed to say that they will let me register tomorrow.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we didn't have any registration, but it's complicated. I also didn't realize that I had to register. It was also very last minute for me. Okay, that is not just me. I didn't know if that was same or something.
No, so yeah, so if you go down, we're studying tomorrow, yeah, 10 a.m. And yeah, thanks for the word. CRA. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, okay. And they want to. Yeah.
And then this morning it was chaotic.
Yeah, but it was
Here is Diane. Diane, can you hear us? Oh, I see.
well.
Diane, can you hear us?
Anyway, so this is what this worked out.
For a while. She's coming at the very end.
Yeah, but I think they did the testing and
She did here. Okay. Hi, Özlem.
Hi,
Nice to meet you too. And what is important is we remember to turn this on.
But it's not
Here, it means you're talking. Okay. Okay. Oh, the red is when you're talking.
Yes. When they say this is red, this is one. Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's not there, but I also that I forget the name, but I'll forward. They have to, she sent me the last registration for today.
I don't have to.
Yeah.
Hello. Hi. Thank you, everybody. We're going to start. Thank you. Okay. Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished guests, welcome to the United Nations. We are delighted to have you here today, and thank you again for joining us at the Financing for Development Dialogues, From Evidence to Action. This event provides a unique opportunity to bring the academia community into the heart of discussions on financing for development. It is a crucial part of our efforts to establish academia as a crucial partner in the global preparatory process leading up to the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, which will take place in Spain next year. My name is Sarah Nunez, and I am an Economic Affairs Officer here in DESA and happy to support you today. We are honored to welcome you, distinguished scholars, to this panel titled Innovations in Public Finance Management and Feminist Fiscal Policy to Meet the SDGs. As we have a packed schedule and we are aiming to finish on time, I kindly ask the moderator, Ms. Karen Groen, to be cognizant of the time we have to ensure we allow a space for all the panels. To officially begin this session, I would like to introduce Ms. Karen Groen, who is a senior fellow of the Brookings Institution, to start this session. Ms. Groen, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to welcome everybody to this roundtable event on public finance, innovations in public finance, and we deliberately were provocative in the title by calling it Feminist Fiscal Policy. And I want to make clear that not all of us on this panel or roundtable identify as feminists or think what we're doing is feminist, but you'll see that we all share some of the same objectives in promoting a fiscal policy and public finance reform that meets the needs of all citizens, all individuals within a country, and promotes a decent, sustainable, caring, equitable economy. We're struggling for the nomenclature, but you'll hear from our panelists in terms of how we work together. We have a very large group of people today. We're going to go in order of presentations. Our panelists have up to 6 minutes. I'm sorry that we won't have time for discussions from the floor, but if you have questions, if you can write them down and pass them to Laura Rodriguez, who will raise her hand. She'll keep a note, and we'll be able to try to respond to you through email or other means. Unfortunately, one of our panelists is delayed on the train from Washington, D.C., so we'll bring him in at the end of the agenda. You're going to hear today some conceptual and theoretical work, as well as country-level experiences. We have 2 panelists joining us remotely, but we wanted to bring you a flavor of the academic work that's ongoing on gender equality and public finance. So I'm going to open the floor and invite Laura Abramovsky, who's with the Overseas Development Institute, to lead us off by talking about her research on fiscal policy.
Thank you. So my remarks today are based on my research looking at the impact of tax and spending policies on income gaps through redistribution across and within households with different characteristics, and this includes women and men, or different levels of income, or different regions in a country, for example, but also looking at the impact of tax and spending on the economic returns to formal employment that reduce the time women spend on unpaid work, and hence the opportunity cost of doing paid work. So I want to start by highlighting that when thinking about how to use fiscal policies to close economic gaps between women and men, it is key to consider the tax and spending system as a whole and how to best target the most vulnerable, including lower-income women. Not every tax and spending policy has to aim to reduce gaps between women and men and be pro-poor. What we need to think is what are the reasons, the drivers of women that are leading women to be poorer than men in the first place. Successful policies are those likely to be more directly addressing these causes. So what does the evidence say? Across all countries, women are poorer than men, so progressive systems of tax and spending can alleviate gaps between men and women just because of that. Gaps in market employment and their counterpart gaps in work outside the market, unpaid work and home production are key drivers of income gaps, including, for example, caring for children or fetching water in low-income countries. I want to highlight key recommendations for more progressive and effective, efficient tax and spending systems. And I will go very quickly through different types of taxes and spending. I want to highlight in terms of direct taxes, it's important to improve the progressivity of income taxes, so those with greatest ability to pay taxes while targeting social spending to those most in need. We need to ensure that personal income tax rate structure, thresholds, and definition of the tax base is progressive, all these parameters, and consider taxing different income sources, capital income, labor income at the same rates, including, as I said, capital income. Related to this, considering aligning the rates of corporate income tax with the top rates of personal income tax, considering property taxes as well, and something very important in low-income countries is to avoid focusing on taxing the informal sector to expand the tax net, or devoting significant efforts to collect taxes from lower-income individuals or small businesses that are unlikely to bring revenue to the tax revenue authorities, and will be, in any case, regressive, inefficient, and undermine social contract. We need to reconsider tax expenditures in terms of the design of personal income tax that could be very regressive if done incorrectly and not benefiting women. In terms of indirect taxes, using a VAT that is based on a broad-based uniform rates to raise revenue in an efficient way is very powerful to fund equalizing spending, but also considering imposing excise on socially harmful goods and compensate poorer households, including women, if necessary. So thinking about packages of reforms. Briefly, but very importantly, in terms of expenditure, I think thinking about cash transfers, we need to use a combination of contributory and non-contributory transfers targeted at individuals rather than family-based income. Consider reforming or directly removing inefficient and pro-rich, pro-men indirect subsidies, such as those on fossil fuels. Very important, looking at family-based policies. So subsidies to childcare and paid parental leave can help encourage women with young children to return to work, but also it's important to think about the quality and the number of hours that is being provided so that women in lower income households can use these services in a way that enables them to access paid work, but also that the quality is very good so that the children benefit in terms of early childhood development. Last but not least, in particular in low-income countries, as you may know, there are big gaps in health, education, infrastructure in water and sanitation and electricity, for example, that affect women particularly to a higher extent than men. And so addressing these gaps and ensuring that women can spend more time studying and less time fetching water cannot be emphasized enough. Some final additional key recommendations, I think, is to consider packages of reform. So think about, we want to remove subsidies to fossil fuels, and because they are regressive and inefficient, but by doing so, we may hit some poor households particularly bad. We need to try to combine the removal of these subsidies with targeted cash transfers that can help those households at the lower end of the income distribution, so you gain, you can compensate them, but still make sure that people that can afford pay more, and they are better systems. I think one other remark I want to make is that we need to invest in the collection and sharing of survey and administrative data from revenue authorities, but also household and individual surveys at the individual level with sex identifiers across all countries so that we can understand what's going on in the ground and do better analysis and hence design better policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. And I'd like to recommend Laura's working paper on fiscal policy. She also has a working paper on fiscal policy and gender, which will be circulating after this summary. And the work that ODI, the Overseas Development Institute, is doing on this topic is also a great resource for people. I'd like to turn to my colleague, Homi, who has made it in time. Homi Karasa is my colleague at the Brookings Institution and the Center for Sustainable Development. He's a senior fellow, and he'll be talking to us. The opening was very important because he's going to be talking to us about debt and fiscal space, which is really the overview for the rest of this conversation. Over to you, Homi.
Thank you, Karen, and my apologies for the just-in-time arrival. Look, I think the backdrop to a lot of discussions right now is what people call the really limited fiscal space that most countries have. And the fiscal space is partly because of very high levels of debt and debt service. And you now have this meme that in many countries, there's more spent on debt service than on health and education combined, and things like that. The point that I wanted to really make is that fiscal space should not be thought of in terms of just a technical concept. Fiscal space depends critically not just on your macro parameters, debt service, growth rates, etc., the size of the deficit, but also on the quality of institutions. And I think that's really important. So another country that spends more on debt service than it does on health and education is the United States. Nobody talks about, lack of fiscal space in the United States. They might have a discussion about the budget and what an appropriate budget deficit is, but it's a different type of discussion. And it's not just the quality of domestic institutions that are important, it's also where you are situated in the world. So if you were to look at, let's say, the macroeconomic aggregates for Poland, Poland has a public debt to GDP ratio of about 55%. The projections are that's going to rise roughly by 10 percentage points over the next 5 years by 2029 to about 66, 67%. Almost every African country has public debt to GDP ratios lower than Poland. Yet they all have far more limited fiscal space. And why is that? It is basically because Poland has the full faith and backing of the European Union and access to the European Central Bank. So it is therefore able to borrow at significantly lower interest rates than are countries in Africa. I'm just using Africa as an example, but for most developing countries do not have that kind of backstop and fallback. So that makes institutions that makes domestic institutions of particular importance in developing countries because they do not have that same degree of support from international, what we might call the international financial architecture. And so there's a big discussion about the reform of the international financial architecture that is ongoing. But until something happens on that score, you cannot rely on it to expand your fiscal space. So what are the main elements of expanding fiscal space? Well, one we already just heard about. It's through taxes. I think we need to be slightly cautious. Our colleague Nora Lustig at the Commitment for Economic Equality or Equity, sorry, thank you, has done very careful work on fiscal incidence and by and large, comes to the conclusion that because most taxes in developing countries are from sales taxes or VATs, some kind of an expenditure tax, they tend to be pretty highly progressive. And it's all very well to say, well, let's expand income taxes and other kinds of things, but in practice, that's proven to be very, very difficult, and very few governments have been either willing or able to do that. So I think that the likelihood of really being able to generate tax-financed expenditures, however good those expenditures might be, is actually quite limited, especially in an environment where economic growth is quite sluggish, and the only real way in which you tend to get increases in the tax to GDP ratios in countries is in the context of fairly rapid growth, where, more or less, most countries have systems where the tax system is quite buoyant, so then with growth, tax to GDP almost automatically goes up without very dramatic kinds of reforms. So I have to say that, even though it's desirable, I don't think it's likely to be a real driver of the kind of spending. So that actually then brings one to expenditure management. And if I were to kind of try to summarize where the discussion on fiscal space is going, I would say it's going to start to separate out between recurrent spending and investment spending. And I think that's actually a very useful, very healthy thing to do. And what I would like to argue is that when we think about investment spending, we shouldn't just be thinking about buildings, bricks and mortar and infrastructure. We should also be thinking about investment in human capital. We should also be thinking about investment in nature. And we should also be thinking about investment in social capital. And that, I see, is where a great deal of this discussion goes, because when one talks about things like the care economy and things like that, to me, these are investments in social capital that can potentially have a fairly high return and therefore fit more readily in that below-the-line calculus of fiscal space than above the line. Thank you.
Thanks, Homi. We're going to come back to some of these themes, and we may even have some disagreement in our points of view, which I think is very, very healthy because these reflect the current debates that are going on. I would like to turn next to Myra Buvanic from the Center for Global Development and Data 2X, who's done some very interesting work on the history of development finance for gender equality. And while Homi didn't say this, it may be the case that low-income countries need bilateral assistance in the form of grants and concessional aid as opposed to borrowing. And this is something that's quite important from a gender equality lens. So let me turn to Myra.
Thank you, Karen. And certainly countries do need concessional assistance for spending on gender equality objectives. Historically, the donors have underspent on gender equality and have not spent monies effectively from the 1970s onwards. At the late 1990s, the share of official development assistance going to gender equality increased, grew, but, still this share is below what is needed. It went from 5% in 2002 to 42% 2 decades later. But remember, this is a share of commitments, not expenditures, and it's inflated because it has other objectives included in addition to gender equality. More importantly, I think, donor monies, and as Homi was telling us, there's not much fiscal space around. Donor monies need to be better spent. I think that donors need to do actually money management, as Homi was saying, and adjust donor financing to a changed world for women, countries, and the multilateral system. Women have made significant progress in the last 50 years, but they now face substantial backlash. Countries have moved to the driver's seat, but face multiple challenges, including substantial debt and reduced fiscal space. And the multilateral system is under stress to cope with climate change, changing demands, global crisis, and reform. So suggestions for better or more effective spending of donor financing on gender equality include 4 complementary major initiatives. First, fit-for-purpose donor financing. Second, results-oriented financing. Third, finance global public goods, data and research. And fourth, donor coordination and thoughtful collaboration as the underlying approach to these other three main complementary initiatives. First, strategic fit-for-purpose financing is important, is critical. I'm asking donors to do the homework and finance efforts to overcome binding constraints or find unique opportunities. This means pursue depth of focus rather than unfocused mainstreaming. Fit for purpose, smart financing includes assessing the gaps and obstacles and moving beyond visible objectives to finance the underlying mechanisms and connectors or enablers. Second, result-oriented financing driven by evidence, akin to policy lending in the IFIs, encourages domestic ownership and gives degrees of freedoms to implementers, but ensures accountability. This puts pressure and a premium on domestic ownership and having the client in the driver's seat. Third, finance global public goods, data and research. Fit-for-purpose financing and results-oriented financing rely on having good data, good evidence for their successful implementation. Do not lose sight of the fact that without investment in gender data, we cannot understand, let alone course correct for advancing the gender equality agenda across the world. Finally, and fourth, strengthen coordination with other donors, seek public and private collaboration, and be thoughtful about what you're doing. Evaluate outcomes and cost and course correct based on evidence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Myra. Those are very, very practical recommendations for donors, and I think they apply as well, not just to the bilateral institutions, but clearly to the multilateral institutions as well. Our next round of comments is going to focus on the country experiences with public finance management, public finance reforms, linking tax to expenditure policy. And I'd like to start with Latif Dramani from Senegal. He's the head of Craig and also a university professor. Latif, over to you.
Okay, thank you. My remarks is about three country experience. This year we have Senegal, Togo, and Niger. And our new estimates, which come from country data, new estimate from time used for some of the countries, and for some of them, time use modules, give the fact that the weight of care economy is very huge. In Senegal, it's 19% of GDP, 57% in Niger, and 37% in Togo. That's very, very important. And we see that then is a fiscal policy space. And because when we work with policymakers in those countries, we discovered that there is no specific policy on those on these care sectors. Then our estimates using macro models shows that strategic and sustained investments in the public care sector has a very significant multiplier effect on the creation of new jobs on the sector, in the care sector, and the generations of public revenues. And the effect is for Senegal, for example, is that's the increase of tax base of 6% of GDP. Niger, 17% of GDP, and Togo, 11% of GDP. And two recommendations we can propose for policymakers is that first is to implement proactive policy in the direction of formalizing the care sector in those countries, because now the care sector is informal. There's no policy, it's informal. And the second is invest strategically in the care sectors. That's to hope that this strategic investment will create new jobs and also will create a space for fiscal policy and tax basis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Latif. And I don't think you fully used your time, so if there are questions at the ends on your macro models which you've developed, he has used very innovative data on time use and macroeconomic growth models. If you have questions for Latif, we'll come back to you. I'd like to turn next to Gloria Aful-Mensah, who's joining us from Ghana. Gloria is at the University of Ghana and working on public expenditure management there. Gloria, over to you.
Thank you, Karen. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
And hello?
Hello, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. So my submission is based on a project we are working on, which is about women's economic empowerment. And part of the thematic areas is to analyze public spending and revenue mobilization. So this afternoon or evening for my end, I will share with you two of the spending policies which I think that could have a very great impact on women. Unfortunately, we are not seeing it. And these two policies are one on agricultural sector and then the other on the care infrastructure. So agric, because in Ghana, about 30% of employed women are directly or indirectly in the agricultural sector. So that is very important for women's economic empowerment. So this policy was launched in 2017. It is called Planting for Food and Jobs. And essentially what the policy does, or it is formed around 5 pillars or components. And these are seed, access and development, fertilizer access and system development, extension services, marketing, and then e-agriculture. So you can see that it touches all pertinent issues along the agricultural chain. Now, the policy, like as you can see or you hear from the key components, it's a fantastic policy, but the challenge has to do with the way it was designed and how it is being implemented. So, for instance, if you look at the eligibility criteria, a farmer is supposed to have a land size between 0.5 and then 2 hectares. And if you look at Ghanaian, the average Ghanaian female farmer, this is too huge. A lot of them do not even have land size that is up to a hectare. And this is in fact being, it wasn't surprising that there was a study done just after 2 years of the implementation of the project. And it was found out that about 85% of the beneficiaries were men. And so clearly, even though this is a good spending policy, which could have a great impact on women farmers, by design, the kind of requirements being attached to the project indirectly discriminates or prevent women farmers from benefiting from it greatly. Another has to do with the way in which farmers could access the support. There were very few retail points, and they were typically set up in the district capitals or big towns, which are typically far from the villages. And so it brings in transportation costs. And so clearly a lot of women farmers are not able to access this policy. And so, I mean, obviously, if we want a lot of female farmers to benefit from this, then it means that we should have the project should be decentralized enough to reach a lot of people, in fact, a lot of women. The other policy which I would want to talk about is has to do with the care policy. And in Ghana, if you look at our most recent demographic and health survey, which was done in 2022, the average fertility rate is about 4, so 4 births per woman. And even though the population is quite young, for the past 3 decades, we are seeing or we are experiencing some sort of population aging, and all these have implications on care. And if, again, from the demographic and health survey, which was done in 2022, it was found out that only 29% of households in Ghana use clean fuels and technology. So by clean fuels, we are referring to LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, natural gas, biogas, solar, and alcohol. So it tells you that a lot of Ghanaian households rely on solid fuels, and we know the implication it has on not just the time involved in collecting the firewood or those solid fuels, but also on the health of the people who are engaged in cooking directly, and this is typically women. And so in 2013, there was a policy, a public spending policy that was launched by the government. So this is called the Rural LPG Promotion Program. It was launched by the Ministry of Energy. And the main purpose was to boost the use of LPG in rural areas. So clearly, this is also a very good policy. That's, it's supposed to have very good impact on women. But the problem is that the policy gives filled cylinder to households. Now, that is a one-time subsidy. So what happens when the gas is finished? It has to be refilled. And you expect that in most cases, the cost will be on a household head, who would typically be a male household head. So he may decide not to refill because of the cost involved. And then the household may revert to the use of biomass fuel. And of course, the burden would disproportionately be on women and girls who will be involved in either fetching for this biomass fuel or doing the cooking. Another thing has to do with there were very few LPG refill points, which again means that households will have to travel a longer distance, and the cost involved, the time involved, even if they have the money to refill it. And obviously it means that to be able to have a greater impact on women, it requires investment or spending in building more refill points. Okay. So I just introduced these two because based on our analysis, we propose some recommendation which we believe that it would lead to more robust spending, public spending management. One of them is, if you look at the way our spending policies or even our revenue policies are formulated, it's typically from top to down, or the literature would say the technocratic approach. And so it doesn't really consider, when they are conceptualizing these policies, women are not brought on board. And so right from the conceptualization to the implementation of those policies, you are not able to incorporate certain concerns or views of women which could have made the policy better. And so one of the recommendations that we make is that in designing public spending or public spending on these facilities, it is important that we probably move from bottom up. So you begin to ask the concerns of women or those that the policy are directly supposed to impact on, so that from that, the policy can be, from the conceptualization, you can reflect those concerns. The other recommendation is that okay, I'm just ending, so just about 30 seconds. So even though we are talking about spending policies, there's a need to look at how we generate them. So if you look at our tax system, About 77% of our revenue comes from taxation. And there's a need for restructuring, significant restructuring in our corporate income tax. And one of the recommendations we make is to remove certain tax holidays and incentives on corporations. One of them is tax incentive on real estate. These are supposed to build affordable housing, but unfortunately, we are not seeing it in the Ghanaian context. They build houses that the ordinary Ghanaian cannot afford. And so we recommend that the corporate income tax system should be restructured in a way that we can rake in more resources to be able to provide for the care infrastructure that we lack greatly in Ghana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gloria. Thank you for that last recommendation, which echoes some of what Lara Abramovsky mentioned earlier. I'd like to turn now to Lekha Chakraborty, who's with the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy in New Delhi, India.
Yeah, it's okay. The context of India and the Asia-Pacific context, I recently worked, and it came out, it's published as a book on fiscal policy for sustainable development. So my presentation here is based on that research and the empirical evidence I have done in the context of India and Asia-Pacific. Here, we begin with the macroeconomic context of fiscal rules. Like we have the fiscal policy that is kept very accommodative in India and, of course, in other Asian nations. So within this accommodative fiscal space in the post-pandemic era, if you look into, that is closely tied to the capex formation in the economy, but it is not beyond the capex formation or to reduce the output gaps. So initially, the low interest rate regime helped, but now as the interest rate is mounting, the public debt management is getting difficult, and that is tightening the fiscal space. So two ways we can do that. One is the tax buoyancy we can improve. Otherwise, we need to cut the expenditure. So usually, the nations, when the taxes are not buoyant, they are decreasing the public expenditure to retain that fiscal space within the fiscal rules. So in that context, it's affecting the human development related spending, and especially the women or the gender related spending. So here the entry point is, of course, not the fiscal rule. There we don't have any space. So the public financial management reforms has happened across countries in terms of innovating the fiscal innovations, in terms of practicing fiscal innovations, and we have public financial management reforms happening across countries. And in that PFM reforms, two transitions are very important. One is the fiscal transition and energy transition that is closely linked. And the second is the demographic transition. There, the narrative that your fiscal space is closely correlated to reducing output gaps or capex spending is not working very well. We have to expand it to social infrastructure incorporating the care economy infrastructure, food security, social security measures, and employer of last resort policies where there is a huge component of gender is intrinsic. Now, the principle of subsidiarity. When we talk about the gender-related concerns, the fiscal policy that is not confined just to the top level of government, that important decisions are taken at the level of the government closest to the people. So what is the principle of subsidiarity we can apply when we talk about the gender equality concerns and the fiscal policy? There, as Karen mentioned, there's an important link between the taxes and the expenditure, the way they design, because the tax stability or revenue stability is the base of expenditure design. Their intergovernmental fiscal transfer is very important because that's a major source of revenue for the subnational governments. But the flexibility of finances at the subnational levels of government, that's not there if the conditional grants are happening from the top level of government to the subnational governments. Here, the good news is that in many countries, there is a tax devolution formula from the higher level of government to the lower level of government. So if we can integrate the criteria relate to the gender concerns within the intergovernmental fiscal transfer formula, and also, we have to sensitize the institutions which are designing, including the finance commissions or the fiscal commissions, to take it ahead, so that, that's one of my important recommendation on board. The second recommendation is that we don't have clear data about gender disaggregated data to look into the question related to the fiscal policy and inequality concern. Inequality, the income inequality and the widening inequality in the context of post-pandemic, that is affecting gender inequality. So this correlation between the income inequality and other types of inequality getting into gender equality question need to be looked into by creating the data, not only the men and women, but also we need to look into the identity issues. Here, the incidence analysis is very important. So a clear narrative that the government should take it up, the benefit incidence and the tax incidence analysis to look into the fiscal policy and inequality issues. That's another important, recommendation which I would love to put forward. And the last one is, the governance deficit equally matters. So when we talk about the efficacy of fiscal policy, we also need to look into the effectiveness of fiscal policy by taking into the consideration of, the governance and the institutions that matters. And I stop here. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lekha. I'm sure there'll be some questions about the intergovernmental transfers, with which I agree it's really important. A lot of expenditure needs to happen at the local level, particularly if we care about the infrastructure for care services. That's a local level function, and local level governments don't have quite the revenue handles that national governments do, so we really need to think about what those are for local governments. I'm going to turn to our last country example, which is Yuna Maluka, who is with New York University in Tirana, Albania, and she's going to talk to us about Albania's experience. Go ahead, Yuna.
Thank you very much, Karen. My inputs today are based on my experience serving as economic advisor to the Prime Minister, but also from research in measuring the size and the contribution of the care economy in Albania, which was as a result of the first Albanian development policy loan to support women's economic empowerment in Albania through access to economic opportunities. This development loan was done in collaboration between the World Bank and the French Agency for Development, and it came with a set of specific policy measures that the government needed to commit to, either to start new reforms or to take forward reforms that were already started by the government. And so the three main pillars on which this was focused was improving women's access to assets, leveling the playing fields for women by increasing access to income-generating opportunities, and strengthening the institutional arrangements for evidence-based policy making. And so during this work and carrying forward these reforms, but also providing technical assistance with this loan, it became very evident the importance for measuring the care economy in Albania, which as we know, it's a sector which is invisible and therefore is underestimated, and oftentimes it's neglected, but that has a major potential if it's used productively. And of course, it's also essential for the functioning of the visible economy, and can lead to activities that could be transferred to market economy, and therefore it has enormous potential for job creation, and also within this job creation, unlocking the potential for women's employment and act as a lever for economic growth. Now, this analytical work also can serve to inform project design when it comes to support care services, whether child care or elderly care. And of course, it can also lead to effective strategies for engaging government counterparts. And so when we did the estimates of the size and contribution of the care economy in Albania, we also identified and saw that there is great potential for job creation, whether that is direct job creation or indirect job creations by providing care services and then allowing more mothers to enter the labor market. And this is also associated not just with the job creation, but what is associated with that is the potential increase in consumption as a result of the extra wage bill. Now, there's also other potential, such as the increase in contributors to the pension scheme and therefore also protection in the old age, as well as reducing the bill for the government in terms of providing social pensions, which are provided to people who have never contributed to the pension scheme and are over the age of 70. And so therefore also improving the overall sustainability of the pension scheme. Now, the care sector growth also can induce growth and job creation in other sectors, as well as improve or increase the government revenue due to tax collections, whether it's for income tax or VAT. And also, since we are talking about the development policy loan, it can also service the debt that has been accumulated. And then, of course, it can have great potential in terms of investment in care facilities, investment in human capital, as well as social capital. So very briefly, our estimates showed that the unpaid domestic and care work accounts for about over 1,300,000 full-time equivalent jobs. And of course, as expected, about 86% of that is taken by women. And then in terms of estimates about the value added of the care economy, we have estimated that the unpaid domestic and care work accounts for about almost $1 billion. And again, the majority of the contributions at about 86.3% would come from women. So then where does this lead us, and what are a few recommendations that come out of this work? Well, it has to do with improving allocation of resources to create more care facilities, especially in the underserved care facilities for crèches for education for the ages 0 to 3, as well as elderly care, to provide incentives to large enterprises and collaboration between public and private sector, as well as the nonprofit sector, to offer more care services, again, whether that is childcare or elderly care. And last but not least, to encourage also alternative models of care provision that can ensure or facilitate a transition from informal to formal employment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Una. One thing that's striking, I think, about these country experiences, as varied as these country contexts are, everybody has referenced both the invisibility of care, but the fact that care underpins the paid market economy and is an important source for public investment. And we'll come back to that at the end. I'd like to turn now to Aslam Onuran, who's an economics professor at the University of Greenwich and one of our best macroeconomic modelers in the feminist economic community. Over to you, Aslam.
Thank you very much, Karen. Our research focuses on macroeconomic modeling of the effects of fiscal policy for a caring, sustainable green economy. And empirical findings that come out of this research show first that our sustainable development goals are complementary rather than competing. And our research itself basically hits about 8 targets ranging from good health and well-being to gender equality, infrastructure, and climate action. So if I come to the empirical findings of the macroeconometric modeling, particularly focusing on the effects of public investment in the care economy, that is social infrastructure investment, we find very strong effects both in the short run and the long run, both on the demand side and the supply side. So on the supply side, there are very large effects both simultaneously and in the medium run on gross domestic product and employment in both emerging economies and high-income economies. We have looked at 8 emerging economies: Chile, Colombia, Indonesia, India, Turkey, South Africa, South Korea, Philippines, and on the high-income side, we have modeled the UK. So one finding stands out: the multiplier effects of public investment in the care economy infrastructure are very strong, both in terms of the effects on private investment and private household consumption. And thereby there are multiplier effects on national output and income. When I come particularly to the effects of the care stimulus, different from effects coming from other types of public investment, say in the green economy or other physical infrastructure, the effects are not just about the level of household consumption, but also it changes the composition of household consumption. Spending in the care economy creates more income in the hands of women because this sector is still predominantly employing women, and more income in the hands of women leads to better outcomes at the household level in terms of spending in goods and services that are conducive to better health, education, or nutrition outcomes of children and the household in aggregate. On the supply side, in the long run, we also find very strong effects, both in terms of a positive stimulus to productivity in the aggregate economy, that is output per hour of labor in the aggregate economy outside the care economy itself. It also has a very strong positive effect on the labor supply, particularly when it comes to women's labor supply, which is constrained by lack of care economy infrastructure. So these two long-run supply-side effects does give evidence or make a business case for our argument that care economy is investment. It is investment in public social infrastructure, and infrastructure is not just about bricks and mortars or physical infrastructure. Obviously, the time period of these effects differ, looking at different types of public investment in the care economy. When you look at childcare investment, for example, you would find immediate effects on increasing women's labor force participation rate, and this will directly lead to an increase in labor productivity in the macroeconomy. But there are also substantial lagged effects, which may sometimes take 20 years, because childcare investment in early childhood education is an investment on human capabilities development. These effects are lagged, albeit quite economically substantial in terms of productivity effects. That brings us to the point that investing in the care economy requires patient and long-term fiscal policy thinking. If I just want to summarize some numbers about the multiplier effects on GDP, at the end of 5 years in cumulative, the multiplier effects of the care economy investment by the public sector in most cases of the emerging economies and the UK we have looked at range between about 1.6 to 4.6. So they are positive and larger than 1. That means there is actually some fiscal space there. In terms of the cumulative effects, at the end of 5 years, if you repeat that care economy investment, because it is a recurrent spending, on average, across the 8 emerging economies, we are getting about 11% increase in GDP, about 6.3% in employment, hence in between productivity increases. There are jobs created both for women and men, albeit at a faster rate for women when it comes to the care economy. So how are we going to fund this precious public investment in the care economy, along with investing in our other multiple SDG targets, for example, the green economy, well, there is money. Partly, it is self-financing thanks to those high multipliers on the demand side. But of course, the bread and butter of financing, I will come back to Laura's point, is about progressive taxation. I will add that it has to be not just of income, but also wealth, particularly targeting the top of the wealth distribution. If you were to introduce wealth taxation on the top 1%, including in middle-income economies, this will tremendously improve wealth distribution. It will reduce wealth concentration. This is in itself a stimulus to private investment rather than a barrier. So wealth taxation of the top would be a key policy for funding a needs-based fiscal policy to tackle multiple SDGs. And wealth distribution itself is more gender unequal. Borrowing has to come to the picture. And if you wish to devise a fiscal credibility rule for borrowing, particularly relevant maybe in emerging economies and middle-income economies, you need to redefine infrastructure. Infrastructure has to include care economy, social infrastructure as well. And of course, national investment banks are there for us also to mobilize resources for investing in the care economy, along with the green economy and other SDGs. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Aslam. And I think your findings from the 8 countries resonate with some of the findings that our other country counterparts have discussed here. I'd like to turn to Diane Nelson, who's the last panelist in this roundtable, who's going to pull out some key takeaway messages, we hope, for the DESA Secretariat and the governments that are negotiating the outcome documents. And if we have time, we may have 1 or 2 questions, and I want to wrap up with a few words. Over to you, Diane. I'm sorry, Diane Elson is Professor Emeritus from the University of Essex. She's very well known for her work on gender-responsive budgeting, for taxation, and she was awarded an honor from Tufts, I think it was Tufts University, as one of the most innovative 50 development economists of the last decade. Over to you, Diane. You're on mute. You need to unmute.
Diane, do you hear us? You need to unmute. She's trying to, yes.
You see from your screen that you're still muted.
Okay, I think I did it. Yeah?
Good.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Please proceed.
Good, thank you. Sorry for that technical hitch. Well, it falls to me, I think, to try and draw together some of the threads of this very interesting presentations that we've had. We've had contributions based on detailed case studies and modeling for a number of emerging and low-income countries, and also on deep cross-country knowledge of aspects of finance for development. Contributions have highlighted the importance of a dynamic approach, acknowledging the importance of demographic and energy transitions, and have emphasized that while some development impacts take place in the short to medium run, others only come to fruition in a long run of up to 20 years. So there's a need for patient finance. We learned that a holistic and strategic approach is needed for finance for gender equality, going well beyond expenditure tagging. And our speakers have considered the fiscal system as a whole: expenditure, taxation, borrowing, and ODA, in terms of the implications for gender equality and the realization of SDG 5. They've emphasized the importance of strategic investments in priorities, not unfocused attempts at gender mainstreaming. In particular, we've heard a focus on investing in the care economy. And I want to draw out that this is not only important for realization of SDG 5, such an approach has wider benefits for efforts to strengthen fiscal systems for realization of other SDGs and to address the climate crisis. Because, first, it focuses on the unpaid as well as the paid economy. And this is going to be critical for dealing with the climate crisis as well as gender equality. Second, it focuses on the quality, not only the quantity of investment, a focus on effective spending. Thirdly, it challenges narrow, outdated definitions of what counts as investment. We've heard about the importance of counting spending on human and social capital as investment, insisting that spending on staffing public services is investment, as well as spending on buildings and equipment. Fourthly, this approach identifies the long-term and system-wide benefits to investment in reducing and redistributing unpaid work, making the economic case for investment in the care economy and also in sustainable water and energy systems, with a focus in the long run on increases not only in female labour force participation, but in the productivity of the economy as a whole. This approach also challenges silos by considering interactions between spending across departments. For instance, by emphasizing that spending on early childhood care, education and care enhances returns to the school and health systems and also reduces future costs across a range of other departments, including the justice system and social protection. Moreover, it considers expenditure and taxation together, examining their joint incidence on incomes and standard of living of different social groups, taking into account gender, ethnicity, class, location, etc. A focus on what the tax and expenditure system means for poor rural women in ethnic minorities is a good place to start. It also emphasizes the importance of building trust in the fiscal system so that people are more willing to pay tax because they are more confident it will be well spent. And I think this highlights the problems that we get if governments try to raise broad-based taxes before they've invested in the services that will benefit people. So you have to make sure that people believe and have reason to believe that those services are going to improve before you raise broad-based taxes. We've heard a number of important policy recommendations, but I will just re-emphasize two what I consider to be complementary policies. The first is the creation of more fiscal space through progressive taxation, including the taxation of capital gains and wealth, and challenging unproductive tax expenditures. A fiscal policy for gender equality is not about tax breaks for selected groups of women, but about removing the privileges of wealth, which is mainly owned and controlled by men. It is difficult, but I don't think we should give up on this. And I see some encouraging signs that some governments are thinking about more progressive taxation, including taxation of capital gains and wealth. And complementary to this is increased investment in the care economy. For me, that would be optimally be in publicly provided paid care services that are more reliable in terms of quality and quantity of jobs they create, as well as in services such as sustainable water and energy that are critical to reducing unpaid care and domestic work in households, especially in low-income countries. So the key conclusion, the final message I would draw is that we can strengthen the whole finance for development process through fiscal policy for a caring economy. And I hope this will be taken into account in the ongoing discussions on finance for development. So thank you to all my fellow roundtable members.
Thank you, Diane, for summarizing key takeaways from this discussion. I want to complement what you and our panelists said with a few other things that I think are really important. And I'm going to speak, as everybody who knows me, candidly, because I do that. And I want to call out something that I think is very important for the governments and for the Secretariat that hold the pen. I read the Elements paper, and I don't think it does justice to the messages that we have suggested here. The language of make fiscal systems gender responsive doesn't help governments. It doesn't tell them what kinds of taxes they need to implement, and it doesn't help them in the ways that they need to allocate public expenditure. Governments need to think, as our panelists have said, about thinking through which instruments on the tax side are going to raise the maximum revenue possible, as Laura has said, to fund the right and high-quality investments, as Diane and Usam and others have said, on the expenditure side, the types of things that matter. So let's move away from what I call the blah-blah language to a much more strategic focus on what kinds of things we need to do. So Laura Abramovsky has given us a very good summary, which many others have been calling for in terms of the types of taxes that will raise revenue without the kind of distortionary effects or benefits to certain higher income segments of the population. And while we haven't mentioned it here, governments would do well to think about not, for instance, exempting or zero rating products like tampon taxes or menstrual hygiene products from the VAT, but really financing on the expenditure side of the budget subsidies for those low-income populations and underage populations, particularly girls in schools that need those products. So let's keep the revenue system for what it should be meant for, which is raising revenue, and let's tax those people who have the ability to pay. In regard to wealth taxes, I'm a little bit more optimistic than my colleague Homi is. I think that we have some technological means to actually transfer, if we were to work with the regulatory community in terms of information sharing requirements, greater transparency, relaxing some of the thinking about how we can change some of the rules in terms of transferring financial flows, we might actually be able to do something there. And the proposals of Gabriel Zucman that he made to the G20 are very important, I think, in this regard. And we don't always think about the regulatory community and some of these other key constituencies that are necessary to this agenda. We need to invest in key areas. Care is an economic sector, as we've heard from our colleagues. We need to, it's not the only thing that will happen. We need simultaneously to be thinking about how we change norms between men and women about who is responsible for care. The important point is that actually the provision of care is a public good, because it's what creates the future generation of workers and citizens that's going to support all of us. And it's a responsibility, not a burden. The burden part is the type of infrastructure deficits for which women and children's labor compensate, and that really needs public investment. Finally, I think it's really important that we have give a set of tools that this doesn't stay pie in the sky. And there are tools that we can be using now. Homi referenced the Commitment to Equity project. This is a tax benefit incidence tool. It goes along with microeconomic simulations. It can be used for macroeconomic simulations. Finance ministries are starting to think about who bears the incidence of taxation, who gets the benefits of expenditure. We should be doing more of that type of analysis, and you can do that across an income distribution, which is really important, because we're not thinking about women versus men. We're talking about women and men in households across some kind of wealth distribution or expenditure distribution or income distribution. And that's the way we should be thinking about this. This is an agenda that says, I don't want rich women to pay taxes. Of course I want rich women to pay taxes, but I want them to pay their fair share, but I want the benefits to go to those who are at the bottom, women and men and others. And finally, in order to have these kinds of tools, there's a lot of unused administrative data that governments can draw upon. Governments can do more to collect information on the tax side. Something as simple as introducing a field for the sex of the tax filer in personal income taxes is obvious, but governments are not necessarily doing this. This isn't a rocket science
intervention. But this is something that we need to have. But more important than the sex disaggregation is to really have the information on where the money is going. Is it going to those sectors that in which women and men concentrate but are important for development outcomes like food security, so agriculture is absolutely key, important for human capital development, as we mentioned, and important for I would argue, many other development outcomes. And I think what's important, my last word on this, is about the climate transition, because we have to get serious about thinking about these issues in the context of a transition to a low-carbon, a zero-carbon future. So when Leica talked about the energy transition, that's absolutely critical in the fiscal transition for this. And there's a parallel here that we might want to think about, which is when companies and governments invest in energy infrastructure and in the energy infrastructure of the future, they know that they have to invest patient capital. And that's what we have to do with care. If we can accept it on the physical energy side, we can think about this on the social infrastructure side as well. So we need to, I think, broaden. This conversation is about broadening our paradigms, broadening our notions of what fiscal policy is and isn't, and what it can do, and broadening some of our time horizons for making the investments that we think are absolutely necessary for the future. We're at 2:15, but I know next is the lunch hour, but if we have any burning comment before we close, I'm going to call on this gentleman. If you can just say your name, and then we'll see if one of us or two can respond.
Louis-Philippe Rochon from Canada. Let me begin by saying that I found some of the... First of all, I want to say that apart from these two gentlemen who had to be here because they're speaking, I'm the only man here. And I'm sure this is not lost on you. Thanks, Thomas. I found some of the conversation today very conservative. The emphasis on fiscal space, fiscal policy management, very old ideas. And I think that, like Özlem said, fiscal space comes from spending more. I mean, that's the fiscal policy paradox. Through Verdun's effect, through crowding in effects, that's your fiscal space. So let's not get burdened down by talking about debt to ratio, debt GDP ratios, managing, et cetera. And then finally, one last thing is, I wonder, you know, at the end of the day, even if we bring empirical results like Özlem presented today and the wonderful multiplier effects, et cetera, at the end of the day, you still have governments controlled by rather conservative, probably white men who don't think that these issues are important. And so that's the big challenge, is how do we get through to them, and also to, you know, all the conservative financial interests and influence. Anyways, I will leave that there. I just wanted to say something about that.
Is there any other comments before we conclude? Yeah. No?
From the Columbia Universities, and I'm highly agree with the gentleman here, and I have like similar thoughts when I hear lots of the outcomes from the thesis. We talk about tax policies, we talk about fiscal spendings, but the things are how we persuade the government to implement these thoughts, and especially many of them are dominated by the male, and how we persuade them to make these decisions, adopt our ideas. That's probably the next step we have to consider. Yeah, thanks.
I don't know if any of our panelists want to respond, but I do want to say one. Özlem? I want to say one thing. I won't speak for all of us because you may not agree with me, which is totally fine. But I do want to say that I think that the conversation about public finance management, fiscal policy, public finance reform has two levels. The first is the technical level and what we think is good empirical science, right? And what we're all trained to do in our economics or our finance or our our coursework at universities and so forth. And there's different orthodoxies. I'm going to say different orthodoxies in that context. A neoclassical orthodoxy, a more institutionalist orthodoxy, an even more radical Keynesian, post-Keynesian orthodoxy, and we have different stripes represented around this table. I think many of us feel, probably like you do, that we can get, and maybe Homi would agree to this, that if we increase the fiscal space for demand-side management, we're going to get perhaps as much, if not more so, than the supply side. And I think that's really, really important. We have to pay attention, though, to the quality of the types of employment that's created. It's not just a matter of any job, for instance. It's the quality of jobs that really matter in an economy. And, of course, the supply side is important there in terms of the right kind of skill sets and so forth. But spending does help expand fiscal space, and we have seen that in the last few crises, for example. But we're talking about not just the level, we're talking about changing the composition, I think, of these things, which is really important. The other level that we're talking about is the political level, and it's the framing of these messages that really matters. And sometimes the economic arguments that we all have been working on for many years, increasing in job creation for women generates X amount of investment over the returns to GDP, and reducing wealth gaps, et cetera, et cetera. That hasn't really changed the nature of the conversation. It's political in the end. And I think that means that we have to be a little bit more political in the way that we frame our messages. Now, I don't tend to think, and I'm sorry again to point to my DESA colleagues here, I don't think a message that says gender responsive, public, blah, 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 addresses the political issues that are necessary for changing the nature of the conversation. I do think we have to change the nature of the conversation by talking strategically about the types of revenue-raising measures that are going to get us the kind of revenue that we need, and the right types of ways of targeting expenditure. And Diane mentioned this in terms of moving away from unfocused gender mainstreaming, which unfortunately many of your donor governments are doing. I'm sorry to call you out on this, but that is the reality, to being much more focused on understanding the drivers of gender inequalities. By the way, this isn't just good for women. This is good for women, men, communities, national income, et cetera. So, but we also are up against, as one of our colleagues said, very resistant norms, and we're in a moment of political, a political moment that makes it harder to push for some of the things that we think are important from a good technical as well as a good policy perspective. I don't know if anybody wants to add to that.
I think if you're talking about development finance, middle and further low-income economies, I am becoming more modest about the fiscal space, that we cannot borrow unlimitedly, no matter how good our investment plans are. These economies will be at the mercy of speculative, short-term, footloose capital outflows. They will be a lot more constrained in how much they can borrow. Therefore, and multipliers are big, but it doesn't fund all itself. It's also not a magic money tree, which means you have to tax and spend, but you do have some space for borrowing. We don't know how big that space is. It gets tested every time a government really tries to deliver on these needs and targets and gets serious about it. It gets tested very quickly and quite brutally. Therefore, I think we have to be prepared about using all the tools in our toolkit, including national investment banks. And I didn't have time to say monetary policy as well, but another roundtable, I suppose. Something for the central banks.
And we are happy to have that. I think Leica wants the final word, and then we wrap up.
pointing it out. Who wants to say that the deficit is bad? Deficit is good. But the practical, when we are working with the finance ministries, they are conservative. So how you want to put it on board? That's a question we are grappling with. Otherwise, we all want to say that deficit is good. But the argument here is investing in infrastructure, especially care, that leads to intergenerational equity, not inequity. So that's the point in which the panel is coming from, and that's the way which we are taking it forward to ask the government to take into consideration of the infrastructure, especially care, because it creates intergenerational equity, not inequity.
Yeah. Diane, you have 2 minutes, 1 minute, not even. Final word.
2 points. One, of course, is that looking at tax and spending is only one element of the whole finance for development process. And I think we all fully recognize that you can't completely look at it in isolation. What you can do in tax and spend also depends on things like the financial architecture. So there are voices in other fora today looking at those issues. The second is that many of us wear two hats, both as academics, but also as people who engage in public dialogue about fiscal policy and are very concerned to make it more accessible to people and to make it less technical. So I belong to a group in the UK that does just this and that tries to reach out to a broader public as well as interact with economists and governments so that we can get a better understanding of who's benefiting and who's not, who is paying their fair share and who isn't paying their fair share. So I think we need our academic research. We also need ways of reaching out into a broader community to build the coalitions for the kind of changes that we think are necessary.
And on that note, everybody's liberated for lunch.